Okay, so I'm actually not going to review too much of what we did last time because I do want to get through this to the end of this today. Banks, by their very nature, have interest rate risk on both sides of the balance sheet. So both on the asset side and on the liability side, they have this interest rate risk. And because the vast majority of banks, they tend to borrow short-term and then lend long-term, you get a mismatch between the interest rate risk on the balance sheet. You know, both sides have interest rate risk, but because one is short and one is long, you get this imbalance between those two interest rate risks. And we did look at that very briefly last time when we looked at what happened when a single loan was funded by two short-term borrowings, basically term deposits, and what happened when the interest rate changed and the interest rates went up because the loan was fixed. The net income from that loan went down for the bank. Now, they have a couple of tools which they use to try to estimate the size of their interest rate risk, and both of them are referred to as a gap analysis. One is a maturity gap analysis, and the other is a duration gap analysis. And if you confine yourself to relatively short term, and ask the question, well, you know, what do these things measure? They measure slightly different things. Well, if you think of the maturity gap, which is the first one we'll come to, that tries to address the question, what will happen to the bank's net interest income if the interest rate changes? So this is the maturity gap analysis addresses a question around what happens to that net interest income if the interest rates change, either up or down. Now, the other one, the duration gap analysis that they look at, if you confine yourself to the short term, with that one, what it addresses is what happens to the bank equity, which, you know, the bank equity is the biggest portion of the bank's capital. What happens to the bank equity as the interest rates rise and fall? So those are the two main questions that these gap analyses are actually addressing if you only look comparatively short term. Okay, so in banking, what is a maturity gap? What's a maturity gap? What's a maturity gap? Yeah, go ahead.
Assuming it's the difference of the maturities of the liability and the maturity of the asset.
Okay, so the basic thing there is because there's two sides of the balance sheet, they both have interest rate risk. It's basically the difference between the maturities of the liabilities, that's the money they borrowed, versus the maturity of the assets they have. It doesn't necessarily have to be maturity. It only has to be, like, for example, say it's a 25-year mortgage, but if it has an interest rate review after 5 years, that's the critical period, that 5 years. How long until you get an interest rate review? And for most things, like, you know, term deposit, it is maturity. But something for like a long-term loan, you may have a periodic interest rate reviews. So it's basically the difference between those two things. So if we go and measure this thing somehow, how is that going to help us if we want to manage the interest rate risk that we have? We're all very quiet. Okay, so we'll roll over here. So this is basically what we said before, that what you're really looking at is how long until you get an interest rate review. Sometimes that is, in fact, most things it's maturity, but there may be long-term loans that have interest rate reviews long before maturity. And so what you do is you specify a time period. Now, the time period is, we'll just use 1 year as our time period. And basically, if it comes up for an interest rate review within the time period, and so for us it'll be 1 year, we're going to deem that to be rate sensitive. If it doesn't have an interest rate review within that period, if it's longer than that, then we consider it to be rate insensitive. And where this is used, throughout the world, regulators don't ask for a single maturity gap analysis. Some of them ask for as many as 7 different time periods, and basically you take whatever the time period is, and you look and say, well, how much will have an interest rate review before that period? That will be rate sensitive. how much will not have a review until after that, and they're rate insensitive. And so they look across a whole spectrum of times. But for us, to illustrate this, we'll just use one year. So we add them up. There's your rate-sensitive assets. You simply add up all that you have. You take away your rate-sensitive liabilities, and that gives you the thing we call the maturity gap. So the positive gap, which is rare for a bank, you almost never see this for a bank. The assets are more rate sensitive than the liabilities. Usually it's the other way around. Now, if that's the case, when you think about what will happen in terms of the net interest income, if the interest rates go down, then as your assets come up for an interest rate review, they'll take the lower interest rate. And if you have more of those coming up for review than you have your liabilities, what that means over the short term, as interest rates fall, your net income will go down, simply because the assets will have a review before liabilities. Now, if it's the other way around, this one here, this is the normal one for a bank. Normally it has lots of rate-sensitive liabilities, but not many rate-sensitive assets. In this particular case, what will happen is it will lose net interest income if the interest rates increase, because basically if that happens, then you have to pay more on your liabilities, whereas your assets tend to be fixed, and so you don't have as much option for building them up in terms of their interest rates. Now, this is a rather simple diagram of basically what we're looking at. So again, we're looking at the assets and liabilities, both sides of the balance sheet there. And things that would be rate sensitive in this group here, something like a floating rate loan. So basically a floating rate, you can review that at any point. So that's rate sensitive. Short-term government securities, anything, if we say we're looking at a year period, basically any money market security is going to be rate sensitive because they last longer, shorter than that. And if you've got a variable rate, also known as a floating rate mortgage, again, the bank can basically change its interest rate as it wants to, and so it's considered to be rate sensitive. When you go to the things that are not rate sensitive, long-term fixed rate loans, they don't come up for an interest rate review in the first year, then they're not sensitive. Long-term government securities, say if you buy a 15-year bond or something like that, it doesn't, it's got a fixed coupon, it doesn't change. And you simply add up those on your asset side, split them into two groups. Those are sensitive to your changes in interest rate, and those are not. And on the liability side, you do exactly the same thing. Money market, they're quite sensitive. Short-term time deposits, if you have say for example, someone's put on a 6-month term deposit, it will come up for an interest rate review in 6 months' time. Floating rate notes and so on, they're all, can have interest rate review fairly soon, and so they're considered rate sensitive. And then we look at the other things that are rate insensitive. Demand deposits tend to be put in there because they have a zero interest rate, which is good for you anyway. But their interest rate doesn't change. Simply, they tend to be at zero. Savings deposits tend to be long-term, and so they don't change the interest rate on those. Term deposits in particular, like if you had a 3-year term deposit, it won't have its interest rate change until maturity, and so on. And there's all these other things in there that are fixed. And so you basically simply add up one side, take away the other side, and you look at the difference between them two. And that gives you an indication of what will happen to your bank in terms of your net interest income, if it falls or rises. Okay, and any questions on that before we move on? Okay. So this is a bit of a summary. The liabilities tend to be short-term. Cost of liabilities, so if the interest rates rise, the cost of liabilities, that's the interest rate, they get reset before the assets do, and you end up with lower earnings. If the interest rates fall, then you get lower cost on your liabilities. You can put the interest rate down them, and they reset before your assets, and you get an increase in earnings. And so if you have a positive gap, and this is the rare one, you don't see, this is rare. If the interest rates rise, you get an increase in your earnings. If they fall, you get a decrease. The normal one is this one where you have the negative gap, simply because they have long-term assets, short-term liabilities. And if the interest rates rise, then their net interest income goes down. And of course, if it drops, it's in their favor, and it goes up. Okay. Any questions on that before we go to the duration gap? Okay, there it is. Okay, so what's the duration gap? What's the duration gap? So remember what a duration is?
The difference between the durations of the liability and asset.
Okay, so you can calculate the duration of a portfolio of both of liabilities and of assets, and then you can take the difference between those two things. So we talked about the concept of duration. We talked about how to calculate it for any individual asset, and then we also talked about that you can actually combine these things into a portfolio. And this is what they do. They simply estimate the duration of the liabilities, and they estimate the duration of their assets, and look at the difference between them. Now, because the bank has equity in there, you have to take that into account. But the thing is with the maturity gap, okay, the maturity gap tends to be reasonably approximate, and this is one of the reasons why where it is used, regulators require a number of estimates. A duration gap takes account of all cash flows over the entire life of the investment, or as a liability, either one. So it takes account of all the cash flows over the entire life of either the investment or the liability. And so when we talked about the duration, one of the things we said, and this is where it makes a difference to your equity, is that before the duration, the dominant risk you face is the price risk. And it's after the duration that the dominant risk is the reinvestment risk. And so if you're thinking about what happens to the bank short term, you're going to use the duration gap to estimate what's your price risk, basically, of both your assets and your liabilities. So as we did before, one of the things we did with the duration was we estimated the change in the price of the bond for an interest rate change. You can make an estimate of the change in the value of your portfolio, either asset or liability, using the duration that you've calculated for that particular portfolio. So this is the formula here. So this is the duration of the assets. Now, there's a funny thing in here, and I haven't actually figured out a good way to actually explain this, is that when you actually do this weighting here, that excludes the equity. Okay, so market value of the liabilities divided by the market value of the assets. But when you calculate that, you actually include, you actually include the equity in there at a zero. So that's something just to remember if you're going to have to do one of these. So in one sense, the hard part, as far as the calculation concerned, is calculating the durations of these portfolios, because basically you have to do a duration for every single component of the portfolio and then combine it into a portfolio. But if you can do that, then you end up with a gap. Now, let's think about how this makes a difference. So let me start drawing a picture here of this. So let's think of the normal situation that the bank finds itself in. So here's the interest rates, here's the value up here, and because the assets are long-term, so the value of the assets is sensitive to the interest rate. As the interest rates go up, the value of the assets comes down. Now, because they tend to have long-term assets and short-term liabilities, the liabilities also will come down in value, but they can come down at a slower rate. And so this is your liabilities here. Now, if you simply take the difference between them, this bit in here, this is your equity. which, from what we've seen, is usually about 75% of the capital. 3/4 of the capital is equity. So if you think the difference between the assets and liabilities is equity, what is your net interest rate risk in terms of the value of the equity you have? It starts out wide here, it narrows down, and so this is what it looks like. It goes down like that. So that's your equity there. And when we come to hedge about that, the thing about this is it behaves like a long position in a bond. So in a normal bank structure, if the interest rates drop, then the bank simply gets more equity, simply because if the interest rates drop, liabilities become more valuable, but also assets become more valuable, but then become more valuable at a higher rate. If the interest rate goes the other way, the assets lose value, so do the liabilities, but the assets lose value faster than liabilities, and so your equity goes down. Now, if we look at the other one, which you don't see this in terms of banks, but it's perhaps instructive to look at it. If you have liabilities that were, so assets which are short term compared to your liabilities, there's your liabilities down here. Again, the difference between them is your equity, and your equity, it goes like that. So that's the interest rate here. There's your value up there, and this is your equity here. Sorry. Equity. And that thing there, that behaves, it behaves like a short position. In a bond. And if we want to hedge the risk, whether it's this risk up here, this is your normal risk if you're a bank or if you're something else and you have that type of risk, and you want to hedge it, the fact that the one behaves like a long position in a bond, that's this one, and this one here behaves like a short position in a bond, that will guide us about how on earth we're going to hedge this if we're going to, say, for example, take out a derivative to hedge this. Okay. Any questions on that before we move on? Yeah, you got a question? Go ahead. You don't know what I'm talking about. Can you be more specific? Well, you remember back when we did durations in the section on the bond pricing? Okay. Basically, the flatter those curves are, the shorter the duration. Do you remember that? You don't remember that. You have some brushing up to do. I can tell. Okay, so if you go back and look at that, basically, the higher the duration, the more interest rate risk you have. Now, before the duration, the interest rate risk you face is the price risk. That's the one that dominates. And so if you have, like, your assets tend to be long duration, they are quite sensitive to the interest rate. So they either, if the interest rate go down, they gain value, or they lose value if the interest rates go up quite a bit compared to the liabilities, which are short duration. Yeah. So, yeah, you probably need to brush up on what a duration is and what it means from that section, because we're using it here. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so that's the point up here in words. If the assets have longer duration liability, bank expects interest rates to fall. Well, if you did this deliberately, you would expect an interest rate to fall. Unfortunately, most of the time banks don't have any choice about that. This is simply the structure that you face as a bank. But if you have some control over this, then If you expect the interest rate to fall, this would, and you were right, it would make your bank more valuable. And in terms of the previous one, we were talking about, net interest income. This one here is purely their value, because the value of these assets changes basically in exactly the same way that the value of a bond changes. So this was a picture. There's a negative one, basically the other way around. We said all that sort of stuff. There's a really beautiful picture. So if you were somehow can do this, and typically if you manage this, if you have a zero duration gap, then basically the value of your equity doesn't change as the interest rate changes. Now, normally you can't do that as a bank just by the way you structure your balance sheet. If you want to actually do that, then you typically have to go and use some sort of derivative to offset the interest rate risk that you actually have. So in terms of the regulators, what they require, there's many places that still use or allow the banks to use the maturity gap, but more and more are requiring duration gap analysis, and for many years the large banks, which tend to have more resources to put into this type of thing, they've been doing duration gap analysis for a long time. And of course that gets reported to their regulator. So here's an example. We'll do both a maturity gap analysis on this and a duration gap. So let's grab a bit of paper. So, oops, hang on. Didn't put it up. So we've got assets here, and we'll do a maturity gap first. Is cash rate sensitive? We'll do the assets first. Here's cash, is that rate sensitive or not? No, it's not. And basically it earns nothing in terms of interest rate, and it's got a fix there, so we can ignore that one. What about these short-term investments? It's got a duration of 0.35 years. Are these rate sensitive or not? No. Okay. Any advances on no? How many think that it's not rate sensitive? 2. How many think it is? 1, 2, 3. And the rest of the people don't know. Okay. If we take our period of time as 1 year, with a duration of 0.35, then these things will come up for an interest rate review within the year. So they are rate sensitive. So we better put them down on our list. And so we've got 30 million of those. So 30 million there. What about next one? Long-term investments, duration of 5 years. Are they rate sensitive? Yes. Okay. Any advances on yes? How many people think yes? 1, 2, 3. How many think no? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it isn't rate sensitive, because you think if we set our time, as 1 year, then if these have a duration of 5 years, they will not have an interest rate review until after 1 year, because it takes 5 years to maturity. So they're rate insensitive. Okay? Because they don't come up for an interest rate review until after 1 year. And you can tell that by that. I mean, the other thing you can tell is long-term investments, is if you didn't look at duration, the fact that it's a long-term investment, that tells you, it's not going to come up for a review for a while. So we can leave those out. Got another group there, loans maturing in less than a year. D equals 0.5. Are they sensitive or insensitive? How many think they're sensitive? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, got more than. How many think they're insensitive? Oh, nobody stuck their hand up. Okay, so they definitely are. Half year, yep, they'll come up for review, so we better put them in our group there. How many have got of those? Got 25 million of those. And the last one there, loans maturing in more than a year. Are they insensitive or sensitive? How many think they're insensitive? A few. How many people think they're sensitive? A few others. In actual fact, because they're 10 years, so loans maturing more than a year, assuming they're not floating rate or anything silly like that, then they won't have an interest rate risk review in that year. So they're rate insensitive. So we can leave them out. So on the asset side, we've got $55 million total in terms of assets that will come up for an interest rate review within a year. Okay, so going to the other side, now sometimes you have to make a little guess about this because in some senses there's actually not enough information to do this. What about the demand deposits? Are they rate sensitive or insensitive? Got 10 million of them. Are they sensitive, rate sensitive, or rate insensitive? Yeah. If you make the assumption, oh, was somebody going to say something? Yeah, we would consider them rate insensitive. Now, it does hinge on making the assumption that they don't pay any interest on this. Okay, say demand deposits pay no interest, so we'll assume that they don't pay any interest. That makes them rate sensitive, so we'll leave them off. Okay, got short-term interest-bearing deposits, duration of 0.4 years, 10 million of that. Should we include that on our list of rate sensitive or insensitive? Yeah, it's rate sensitive because it's short term, the duration of 0.4 years. Yeah, we should basically take that into account, so we better put that down. So that's our 10 million there. Going down the list, we got long-term interest-bearing deposits with a duration of 2.5 years, 45 million of those. Are they rate sensitive or not? I see some people shaking their heads, so no, they're not. Okay, because they won't come up for review anytime soon. Borrowed funds, that tends to be money market stuff, duration of 0.25 years, that's a quarter of a year. Are they sensitive or insensitive? Yeah, see some nods. So we better put that lot down there. So that's 5 million. And the equity, that's one of those funny things. We simply give that a value of 0, okay? And so we consider that to be equity to be rate insensitive because it tends to be sort of just the difference between them. So adding those up, we've only got 15 million over here. And remember, our gap is basically rate-sensitive assets minus rate-sensitive liabilities. In this case, it's 55 million, subtract 15 million, and that's $40 million. Oops, 40 million. The other way you can express it is as a percentage, and in this case, 40 million is 50% of the size of the balance sheet. So that's got a positive maturity gap there. So that then, if the bank had actually really had a bank like that, unlikely because it's the odd one, they could then work out from that basically what would happen to their net interest income, looking at that, and then depending on what their forecast was for the interest rate over the future, they may want to hedge that, or if they think it's going to move in their favor, they leave it unhedged and hopefully make additional funds off that. Now, the other one, the duration gap analysis, perhaps anyone want to ask a question on this before we move to duration gap one? Yep, go ahead.
How do you know those long-term is of fixed interest?
Well, yeah, in one sense, like I said, there's actually not enough information here, and you simply have to take a guess. Like for example, the long-term ones, you'll have to assume that they're not floating rate. Okay, so it's a bit of a stab in the dark. But anyway, the fact that, yeah, if you do a fixed income maturity course, fixed income security course, one of the things about a floating rate, a floating rate bond, say a floating rate bond, its duration is the time to the next interest rate review. Okay, so say you had a 10-year floating rate bond, but it had an interest rate review semi-annually, it has a duration of a half a year. Now, we don't cover that in this course, but you could actually, if you knew that, which is like a 30-year level course, you can look at that and tell that these things aren't, they're not floating rate. But for now, because we don't cover that, except I just told you, you'd more or less have to guess that. Okay, any other questions? Right, okay, so we'll do the duration analysis, gap analysis. So we've got the same data there. I just shut this up. Higher. So here's our assets again. And what about the cash? What's the duration of that? Yeah, so it's 0. So the cash, 0 times the 15 million is equal to 0. Okay, what about the duration of the short-term investments here, 30 million of them at 0.35 years? Yeah, you multiply the 0.35 by the 30 million, and that ends up at 10.5. Okay, going down a bit more, we've got long-term investments, duration of 5 years, 5 million of those. So duration 5 times value, 5 million, and you get 25 there. Okay, going to the next group, there's these loans maturing less than a year, got a duration of 0.5, and we've got 25 million of those. So again, 0.25 times 25 million, and that comes out 12.5. And going down to the bottom one there, loans maturing in more than a year, duration of 10, and 5 million of those, that's 10 times the 5 million, and that's 15. So if we add all this stuff up, this comes to 98, and then what we have to do is divide that by its value, which is the 80 million. So the duration of the assets is going to be the 98, which we've just done there, divide by the value, which is the 80, and that comes out to 1.225. Okay, so we've done one side. Yep, go ahead.
I thought the duration of this portfolio is supposed to be weighted of every security in the portfolio. So in that case, that if, for example, if the short-term investment, the duration is 0.35, so it's supposed to multiply the percentage. That's why, so it's 30 divided by 80. Then that's the weighted duration. Then you just add them together.
Yeah. Okay. So I simply multiplied these out, and then I did the weighting at the end. Now, what you're saying is that in actual fact I should have put the 80s in here, and yeah. We get exactly the same number. Yeah, you can do that. That's the weighted average approach. You get exactly the same number if you do that. If you put the 80s in here, these all get smaller, but you come out with exactly the same number. Okay, so it doesn't matter which way you do it. You're going to end up in the same number as long as you do it. Do it right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Another question. Can't. Oh, the half one. All right. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, this one here. That should be a 0.5. Right. Thank you. Fix my mistakes. Okay, so going over to the other side, liabilities over here. What about those demand deposits? Zero. Yes, I did see somebody make that noise. Okay, so they're 0. So 0 times how many we got? We got 10 million. Is equal to 0. Then we got short-term interest-bearing deposits, duration of 0.4, got 10 million of those. So 0.4 times the 10, that comes to 4. Going to long-term ones, duration of 2.5, so 2.5 years times, and we got 45 million of those, and that comes to our 112.5. Going down, borrowed funds, 0.25 times, what have we got of those? 5 million. That's 1.25 there. And equity, again, we give it a 0. Kind of hard to understand why, but we do. And when you add all that up, what's that? 117.75. And again, divided by the total value, 117.75 divided by the 80, and that comes out at 1.472. So we've done the calculation there, and now what we've got to do is actually get the duration gap. Remember, formula duration gap is the duration of the assets minus market value of the liabilities, market value of the assets times the duration of the liabilities. And this is 1.25 minus, this is only the liability, so this is the one that excludes the equity. So that's 70 over 80 times the 1.47. Now, is that still there? Yeah. And so that comes out at minus 0.063. So this is a strange bank. Most banks are not like this. They have the other one. But if we think about what that means in terms of its residual interest rate risk or net interest rate risk, it has an interest rate risk that basically looks like a short position in a bond. So basically, if the interest rates rose, it would become more valuable. If the interest rate fell, it would become less valuable. Okay, any question on that before we go on? Right, okay, so moving along. Picture. So now I'm going to think about hedging this stuff because, as a bank, if you have lots of this interest rate risk and you expect the interest rates to move against you, you might want to hedge this stuff. So let's consider how they might do it. So how might we use a financial futures to hedge the interest rate risk that we have? How might we use a futures? Okay, so the thing to think about this, if you're at all uncertain how to make this work, I would suggest you start by using the price and then convert your diagram into an interest rate, simply because the interest rates and the price move in opposite direction. So if we start with our futures, here's futures, we just draw it normally. So there's the price of whatever instrument we're going to use to hedge. And basically what we have to hedge with is something like a government bond. Okay? So there's our strike price, and typically what you see, there's strike price. So a long position, this will be the payoff from the long position, and what we'll do, we'll put another color in here, and there's our short position for the futures, and then this is dollars. Now that's using the price. On this diagram, the interest rate is increasing in that direction, and so what we should do now, because what we're really concerned about is what happens when the interest rate changes, is we redraw this with the interest rate going that way, and this is the payoff from the short position, and that's the payoff from the long position. So now, let me grab one. Where's my old diagram? Yeah, I'll take this one. So if you had an interest rate that looks like risk, that looks like this one at the top here, okay, that as the interest rates rose, you lose value in your equity, would you take a long position or a short position in the futures to offset this somehow? Well, the long position loses value, okay? And if you look at it here, if the interest rates go up, you lose value. If you take a long position, your long position loses value. So if you do that, you make your problem worse. Okay, you see that? You see that with this position, this is the normal way the banks run. If the interest rates rise, the equity goes down. In the futures, if you take a long position and the interest rate rise, the value of your position goes down, because this is one you're really interested in. And so that simply makes your problem worse. So what you want to do, instead of taking a long position, you want something that rises in value as interest rates rise, and that means taking a short position there, because that will offset losses on your equity. Okay, is that? Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's opposite. I think that bank is the normal bank is supposed to have short position for this one. So they try to hedge the security. So they have to hold a long position to offset the loss.
Well, if you look at, that's why I suggest you start with the price, okay, if you're told doubtful how to draw these things, then convert it from price to interest rate. And so if you think about, say the underlying asset that was being used to hedge was, say, a government bond, because that's where the most liquid part of the market is, in that bond. If the price of the government bond rose, then you would gain value out of a long position. But what that means, if you look at it from an interest rate point of view, the long position will gain value if the interest rates are falling. Okay, that direction is interest rate falling, that direction is interest rate rising. So if you're going to try to hedge a problem that you have, you see, this is my point I put here. This residual or net interest rate risk, it behaves like a long position in a bond, okay? The very fact that it behaves like a long position in a bond means if you want to hedge, you've got to do the opposite. That means you've got to take a short position on a bond. And when we convert this diagram over to interest rate, the short position is the one that gains value if the interest rates rise. Your head hurting. Yes, I know. This takes I shouldn't laugh. It takes a while to figure this stuff out because of the inverse relationship between the price and the interest rate. Okay, and so when I was looking at the other one, I made the point: if they have this other thing where the assets are short duration, liabilities long duration, their net interest rate will behave like a short position in a bond. If you want to hedge that, then you've got to go and take a long position to hedge it. And simply that's, what you would want there. If you were afraid it's going to go that way, you want to get something that's going to gain value as interest rates fall, and that's the long position here. As interest rates fall, the derivative gets value. Okay. Any other questions on that? Right. How's our time going? What's the time? 5 minutes to. Oh, 5 minutes to what? 5 minutes ago. Right, okay. Thought we'd run over time. Okay, so the other thing you can do, Sid, was that, there's our picture. The other one that you can do is the options. And so, again, if you're going to use an option, you again need to be careful about what you want to happen. So let's take a quick look at the options. If you start with the price, then there's your strike price. That's your call option payoff, and then this is your put option payoff. But again, interest rates increase in that direction. So if we then turn this into a diagram with interest rates increasing, you get the opposite, and that is that, there's your strike price. The call looks like that, and your put looks like that. So that's the call, and that's the put. So the advantage to using an option over futures is that if the things move in your favor and you're using an option, you can still take advantage of that. Whereas if it moves against you, you can use your option to protect yourself. But then that comes at a cost. You have to pay for that protection. And so that's why these things start out down here with a negative cash flow if you're buying them, is the cash flow to buy them. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Let's bring the thing down. Yeah, that better? Right. Now, because for something like a bank will have an enormous balance sheet, often it's impractical to go out and buy vast numbers of options because of the enormous costs involved trying to hedge huge balance sheet. So one of the things that they can do is they can actually try to reduce their overall cost. And one of the things they can do is that they can actually, in this case, what they've done here is they buy an option, okay, and looking at that, that's actually this one here. They buy a put, and then they also, to offset this, there's a little cash flow here out, they often can sell a call and hopefully reduce the total cash flow involved here, because trying to buy enough options to do this is quite expensive. And so if you do this, you sell your call and buy a put, is you end up with a net payoff from your derivative that looks like that. And what you're trying to do is make this thing sit on zero so that what you have is a net zero cost for your position. You have to take long on one, short on the other. So one you pay for, one you receive cash flow. But the basic idea is try to get a net zero cash flow out of it, and then you get from your options a net cash flow that looks like this. And if you combine that with your actual risk, which is this one, okay, put that with that risk there, you end up with this thing they call a collar. Now, these things look very strange, and it's really interesting how they work. The derivatives course, the 3112, which is third year, they go into a bunch of hedging positions and why people use these things. So if a bank does this, what you end up with is you have you basically limited your risk to that piece there. So if the interest rate runs in here, you can say, I can tolerate this risk. If the interest rate goes outside that, either goes too low or too high, then your derivatives kick in and they protect you from the additional risk that you would otherwise face if you hadn't hedged. Okay, any questions on that? I suggest you mess around with this one, because this one takes a little bit of figuring out how to get this thing to come to zero. But it can be done. It can, if you buy them with the right strike prices, and the way they've done it here is, let's go back one. They've got a different strike price, for them. You can end up with a net cost of zero for this particular strategy. Okay, there's a picture. So there's a bit of a summary. I think from the sound of things we're running out of time. And there's final one about what's relevant within the chapter. So remember, on Monday we'll have our guest lecturer, Nathan Latimer. And then on Tuesday we'll start the next topic on the non-bank financial institutions. Okay, if you want to ask questions, be around for a while. Otherwise, see you Monday.